Welcome back, everyone, to day 2 of the Grants to States Conference virtual edition. We're happy for those of you that just joined us to be learning about your aspirational travel once pandemic times are behind us, or maybe if they're not even behind us. Where do you think you will be going next or are most looking forward to? You can put that in the chat. We are going to have a first speaker up from it's like the greatest hits of IMLS, one of Matt Birnbaum's counterparts, who is now at the Department of Energy. But as we're getting started and switching out the decks, I'm going to make a few kind of standard announcements. We are recording, and we will be putting these recordings up on our website as soon as we can make them accessible. It usually takes about a week. If you haven't already done so, we'd love to have you add your state initials to your Zoom name so we know where everybody's coming from. We'd ask you again to mute your microphones when you're not speaking or asking a question. And again, once the sessions start, we'd love to have the chat primarily focused on clarifying questions that we can raise up towards the end of sessions to be sure they get answered. You will have a chance to talk to each other today during the programmatic topics. So if there's any rogue Terry DeVos out there, we're hoping to get your name changed to your actual name today. And I'll follow up with a few of you if I see you in the roster. But let me turn it over now to our first speaker of the day, who's going to continue on the theme of 5-year evaluations from yesterday. Many of you have met Lisa Frayhill at our past IMLS conferences. And this is bittersweet because Lisa Frayhill is not an IMLS employee at this juncture. She is now with the Department of Energy, and we miss her so much, but we are indebted to her for committing to coming back and being part of this conference with you because she has a very important perspective on the data files that will enhance and be part of your evaluation. So Lisa, welcome. So glad you're here.
Thanks, it's great to be here, and I once again appreciate being included in the Librarian Reindeer Games. This has been an awesome community to work with, and I miss all of you so very much. So I am going to attempt to share my screen. I actually have multiple computers going right now, so hopefully something's gonna work. And so let's see, so you should be able to see my screen right now, and I will go ahead and place this into presentation mode. Let's see. Okay. So thank you again, Terry, and I hope that this presentation helps. The notion here, building upon what Matt said yesterday in terms of the kinds of data that you need and that you're going to be passing along to your evaluators. I like to think of your evaluators as kind of like your CPA, right? Who's going to do your taxes. You take a big box of stuff, you put it all together, and that's what you're going to pass along to them so that they can work some magic and help you to hopefully find some hidden gems, things that maybe you hadn't even noticed yourself. And so the SPR data is really going to be only a small part of all of that. But hopefully with what we are putting together, the work that your evaluator will need to do with these data will be, a little bit easier, a little bit more facilitated. So hopefully we can, there we go. So I'm going to start with a quick introduction to the SPR. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I'm going to talk about the analysis files that are going to be made available. There's going to be data file documentation associated with them. There'll be an Excel file at the activity level that will be state specific. Then there'll be a project level file that'll have all states. And then upon request, data on detailed budget information can be, you can get that, a separate worksheet with that for your evaluator. And the notion is that all of these can be, merged together or, synced up with each other, but it helps to keep all of the variables separate. I'm going to go over just a couple of sample use cases, and then, to head you off at the pass here, the program officers are going to be in touch with you about how to obtain your data and these files. So let's still figuring out how to get my slides to advance. So you might know that the SPR has all of these very interesting analytical capabilities. There's 14 intents. Those get rolled up to these 6 focal areas. And as Matt said yesterday, those 6 focal areas really represent areas of national interest. Right? But the 14 intents are a little bit more detailed, and that's likely to be something that your evaluators will be interested in. But you can get even more detail about those intents because of these subjects. There's going to be, as I mentioned, 2 Excel files, an activity level file and a project level file. And that's important because there's different types of information that are available in those files. So as Matt was saying yesterday, the 6 focal areas really represent those national level. And over the past several years, if you've been at the LSTA conference meetings, this has been how we've rolled everything up to these 6 focal areas. But the system is designed to have a number of intents, right? These 14 intents that are supposed to align with the 5-year state goals. That when the system was being designed, that was the notion, was that people could find anything that their projects were doing in those areas. And so being able to go back and forth and using that crosswalk that Matt included with his retrospective question 2 will be very handy for your evaluators. In order to do that, and then in addition, as I mentioned, there's a lot of other ways that your evaluators will find the data in the SPR very interesting. As you all know, you can enter data about subjects, and there's like 37 choices plus other, and it's these drop-down menus, and you pull those down and you enter up to 2 subjects per intent, right? And then that happens at both the project and the activity levels. And so that means that there can be a whole lot of different subjects associated with a project and associated with an activity. There's also free-form keyword entry, namely the tags that you can put in. And based on what I've seen over the years, there's a whole plethora of things and ways that people enter data there. So what that means is that that's going to be a conversation you may want to have with your evaluator if there are like specific tags that you have instructed people to enter about projects over the years to help make locating information quicker. So you're going to want to make sure that you have a list of those for your evaluator. The tags are included in the Excel file, the actual text, but there's no flags for the tags. And I'm going to talk about flags in a minute. And then the evaluators will be able to use your tags. So they'll be, so the notion is that, like I said, there's many hundreds of different tags in there, but you maybe have only used a handful of those. So they will be able to search for them relatively easily and do what they need to. And these are all the subjects. I won't spend all the time going over this. And then another thing that happens in the SPR are projects get flagged as exemplary. And I put the definition from the documentation here. It's a project the state library agency considers the best, worthy of imitation, or having the most impact. Such projects show innovation and vision, impact on targeted audience, service to a new population group. And so there's many projects that could be flagged as exemplary, but as we've seen, it's only about 10 or 20% given any subject area. And again, having a conversation with your evaluator about what you were looking for in exemplary projects would be very helpful for them. So I've got a couple of methods notes, and I keep using this word flag, okay? So we use flags, and I was going to use the word quantoid, but not everybody knows what a quantoid is. I am a quantoid. That doesn't mean I come from outer space. The social scientists add these flags so that it makes it wicked easy to identify things in a data file. And the notion is that when you have a multiple choice item, you split it up into a series of yes, no's. So for example, there's 14 intents, but sometimes people can pick more than one intent for a project, right? And so what that means is that you'll have an intent 1 and an intent 2. So instead of having an intent 1, intent 2, and you have to like figure out, oh, look, there's this one on this, I've made it so that there's 14 flags, 1 for each intent. So if a project has 2 intents, it'll have a 1 for each of those intents and zeros for the others. So it really will make pivot tables in Excel wicked easy for your evaluator. Flags were added on intents, subjects, and focal areas in the project file, and they were added for subjects on the activity file. So any item that they could pick more than one thing has been made into a flag, with the exception, as I mentioned, of the tags. So tags are not flags, flags are separate. Your evaluator, a couple of other things that are kind of getting set up with these particular files is the notion that you might want your evaluator to do some benchmarking, namely, how does my state compare to similar others? And so over the years, what we have done is looked at sort of groupings of SLAAs, state library agencies, by sort of the relative size of the allotment. And so there's a variable that'll let your evaluator say, oh, I want to look at other states that are in the same sort of general ballpark of allotment size. And that variable is in there. And that's at the project level. There's also all of these flags. So they could say, hey, I want to look at specific types of projects. And then the other kind of thing that you might want your evaluators to do is to look at trend data. And so even though you don't have to do it, it might be useful to have the FY15 to 17 data as a grouping to compare to FY18 and 19 that you will have available. And so the FY15 to 17 data are included. And again, there's another variable added so that you can easily extract those particular cases from the FY18 cases. So again, it's a methods note for your evaluators. And as a quick note, within the context of the data file, only high-level data about budget, namely total budget, LSTA budget, and the match is included, not all of the detailed categories. Those detailed categories are what's in that optional file that you can request. So these are the three groupings that we've used over the past few years. And I'm not going to go through this slide, but this is the data from last year's talk. Again, you might want to have your evaluator comparing to similar others. And then to give you a sense of what's kind of coming down right now, and Terry and her crew can talk to you a little bit more about the at-a-glance dashboard that's going to be available that does some of this roll up for you in a visual on the dashboard. Terry, did you want to jump in, or did you want Madison to jump in to talk about this, or are you going to do that later?
I mean, I could just say right now, thank you, Lisa, that this was deployed last week. So it is now in the live SPR. If you go to your login page, once you enter your credentials, you should be able to scroll down and see several charts. The first that's visualized on this screen is your state goals by LSTA funding. And then you'll have a chart, state goals by match funding. You'll have a chart, state goals by LSTA funding and match together, and state goals by the number of projects. And you should be able to also export this using the little download button in Excel if you say wanted to get it out of the system and give it to an evaluator. So it's just an at-a-glance where you are in this cycle. And if you change the fiscal year dropdown, which is at the very top of the dashboard, you can actually go back to the prior 5-year cycle if that interests you.
Thank you, Terry. So what is going to be in the data files? So quick way to understand it is that over the years, we've had a number of different questions that we've posed and been able to present information for at the national level out of the SPR. What was the topic area of a project? Why was it done? How much was spent? What lessons did we learn? Was there a target audience? What was done? How was it done? Where did you do it? And what are the results? And there's a number of different SPR variables that are associated with these different types of questions. And what we've done here is giving you a little chart to show you what's in the project level file that's related to these topics and what's in the activity level file. And this is why, this is actually a chart that I'd used at Ripple this year, where I had the privilege to do a session on using federal data, and we talked about the SPR. And what I would really recommend that you may emphasize to your evaluator is that the SPR is a highly hierarchical system, meaning that there is data at the project level and data at the activity level. And if you were to click on download the CSV, it doesn't play well together, and you get kind of, I hate to say it, a bit of a mess. And that's why we've got these nicely designed Excel files so that it keeps these two levels of analysis and the variables that are available at those levels separate for you and for your evaluators. And hopefully that'll make their lives a lot easier. What are the kinds of things? Well, at the project level, they'll be able to use these data to do analyses like this. Look at the median project budget by source, whether it's LSTA or non-LSTA funds, and look at it by focal area. They also will be able to do this at a more granular level for your projects by looking at it by intent or by subject, right? So they'll be able to do those kinds of analyses that will be able to answer some of the questions, the retrospective questions that Matt talked about yesterday. Namely, has there been a substantial focus on specific groups in the activities? Well, data on budget is not available at the activity level, but it is available at the project level. And at the project level, we also have subjects. So that's going to be the way they do that. So it's going to be possible to do those kinds of granular analyses. An example of what they'll be able to do at the activity level is look at what kinds of activities were done, right? How were they distributed across different topics? In this case, this is a graphic that we've used over the years to show basically that the mix of activities stays pretty much the same, except in years when you're doing an evaluation, when there's a lot more planning and evaluation going on. Surprise, surprise, right? So this is the kind of thing they'll be able to drill into this a lot more deeply using the activity level file. So there's going to be data file documentation. And what data file documentation does is it describes what's in the data files, says what the variable names are, gives descriptions, how the variables were constructed. So there's some variables that I alluded to earlier that we put together, either flags or other kinds of variables. So it'll talk about how those were constructed. And then it also will include some helpful hints for analyzing the data. There'll be details about the SPR system, some data quality information over the years. That has been one of the really rich outcomes for me in attending the LSTA conference and presenting these data, is to hear back from you all about some of the issues that you have at the other end of the data spectrum. And so, that has really informed my understanding of what some ins and outs are related to the data quality. And then as well, there'll be descriptive statistics in the data file documentation, frequencies on the categoricals and means and standard deviations on continuous variables. There's a handout that I have been theoretically working on, but it will get done, I promise you. And it will provide some information about some other kinds of data sources that your evaluators might be able to access to be able to provide benchmarking and context for your evaluation. And so these are all a variety of tools and data sets out there that have become actually relatively easy for people to engage with. So that's going to be forthcoming. And again, the program officers will be able to help you with this when the time comes. So I'm going to give just two very short use cases. The first one is to show you how subjects can be used to help identify topic areas in the project and activity files, and then how those can align with state goals. And then how evaluators might use some other information that's in the SPR files to see if there are important lessons learned in project evaluations. So the first one, last year, what we've been doing over the past couple of years is really focusing on various topics and drilling down into them. And I've, sort of done the high level like SPR work. And then Matt and the program officers, Madison, Michelle, and Dennis, have been doing more qualitative work related to understanding, what makes projects in these topic areas exemplary. And that kind of process really illustrates this method that Matt was talking about yesterday in terms of, yes, there's going to be some statistical analysis, some high level information that you're going to want to present, and you're going to be able to extract some of that out of the SPR. But in addition to that, you're really going to want to complement that with a lot more qualitative work in terms of these focus groups, interviews, and so forth, to be able to understand a little bit more about how how things happened with the projects. So in the SPR, we can get high level things like how many projects, what kind of budget, what was the median budget, how many of these projects were exemplary. And in this case, we were looking at digital literacy. So your evaluator can use the subject flag for digital literacy in the project level file to look up the budget, whether it was exemplary, and compare your state's digital literacy projects with those of other states. But then they can also look in the activity level file. And in the activity level file, they can see, well, which groups might have been the beneficiaries of the projects associated with digital literacy. And as you can see, age groups, 50% of the activities that had some kind of a focus had age groups as the focus, right? Then following families and so forth. And then you can also see on the pie chart, that the library workforce was just under a third of the projects or activities, I should say, that were focused on in the in this particular case. And the other thing that I'm showing, the blue boxes give you a point of reference. So digital literacy accounted for, about 50% of digital literacy projects focused on age groups. And that's a lot higher than all activities. So all activities, about 37%. And digital literacy projects or activities tended to focus less so on library workforce than activities overall. Okay. So you can kind of get a little bit of a benchmarking there to see sort of the, how this compares to the larger scheme of things. So in use case number 2, your evaluator might ask you, hey, have you had any projects funded by your state that did evaluations already? And then are there any lessons that have been learned from these? And the SPR has a nice handy way to identify those projects. There are a number of evaluation text fields that are included in the files. And what we've done is we've included some of this. And the notion is that for them, this is going to serve largely as a flag or shorthand. And then they can then track down, have sort of, so here's a list of a handful of projects that they might want to dive into. These might even be people that they want to reach out to for a specific kind of focus group or other kind of interview. So the project level file will have variables that will help your evaluator to be able to know the projects that have already had some kind of evaluation and what's happened as a result of those. So this is really just a brainstorm on communicating with your evaluator. And in terms of the kinds of things that we've prepared, just communicating with them that we've got some Excel files that will facilitate the use of the SPR data, and that it includes documentation that fully describe the data, and that they should read that documentation. That the SPR, this I said before, is a hierarchical data set, so do not download from the web. Projects have multiple activities, and that's something that can be a little frustrating if you click the, I want to get a CSV. And that there are different kinds of data in the project and activity files. So that slide where I summarize the questions, the kind of variables, and whether it's in the project or activity file, that will be very useful for them, and that will probably find its way into the data file documentation. How your state uses the term exemplary, as I mentioned earlier, being able to describe how your state's using it and what the purpose is will be important for your evaluator. There's a lot of tags associated with projects. And again, messaging to your evaluator about which of those are important to you and your state will be will help them quite a bit. And then something you might ask them is, well, what insights about future directions for LSTA programming are suggested in the SPR data? And, this is where there's in the activity files, there's a lot of outputs. Notice I didn't say outcomes. And I know yesterday we had a bit of a discussion about the difference between outputs and outcomes. And I think in this case, in an SPR statistical sense, you want to think of those as outputs. And those are things like, if say digital literacy were important in your state, and so it would be important to show how many, how many people attended the different programs that were run associated with digital literacy, you can get that out of the SPR. So being able to capture a few nuggets of information from the SPR to help, sort of give that high level will be very useful for your evaluators. And they're going to need to really look at your goals, as Matt was saying yesterday, look at the goals, think through the retrospective questions, and then take a look at, okay, so here are the tidbits of information we can pull out of these SPR data that will shed some light on that. And then the questions you might consider in addition, in order to scope the evaluator's tasks with the SPR, how important is it to be able to compare current projects with those of the past for your state? So if for you, what is behind us does not matter, then you tell your evaluator, just work with FY18 and later data. But if you are interested in, really kind of having them make that comparison of 15 to 17 as a group versus, the current time, and there might only be a goal or two that you want that, then you need to communicate that with them. And then that way they don't go down some extra path that they don't need to, or they do if you want them to. And then how important is it for you to have comparisons of your state with others? And again, if your answer to that is, it only matters what's going on here, and we don't really want to do benchmarking, then again, that will make their task a whole lot easier and a lot less data that they'll need to pull out of the SPR. So that's a quick rush through what's in the files and what's coming your way related to this. I know that the SPR data are important to be able to extract, but hopefully the work that we've done will facilitate that and provide your evaluators with a lot more time to spend doing those qualitative things that you'd really like them to do. So I'll open it up to questions. I didn't see, I'm gonna open up the chat here and see what I can see.
We do have a bunch.
Okay.
And I think maybe the place to start, even though it's a little out of order, was just a clarification of what IMLS is going to provide and for what years. Because I mentioned something that is part of the SPR right now that you can download, but I don't want that to be confused with what Lisa is talking about, which is a much more robust set of files that we are still in the process of sort of packaging up so that we can send them out to you. Those will just be for the fiscal years 18 and 19. And because you haven't yet reported your fiscal 20 data, the states will be responsible for providing that to evaluators.
So actually, yeah, I think that's an important distinction. What we've got is Excel files. So they are actual Excel files that they can open up and run pivot tables with. Mm-hmm. So there'll be an Excel activity level file, an Excel project level file, and there'll be data file documentation to go along with it. The reason that we opted for Excel here is that, yesterday there was, some discussion, a little bit of discussion about, the blend of methods that you'll use and what kinds of skill sets. And it's pretty clear after, I'd been at IMLS for about 4 years doing these kinds of analyses, and Excel is a lot easier for people to access. I work in SPSS. Other people work in SAS or Stata or other specialized software. But for the kinds of analyses that you need for your evaluators to do, Excel is perfectly acceptable. There's not a lot of real sophisticated statistical analysis that needs to be done for your evaluations. Now, clearly somebody could do that, but this is to provide them with those tools. And this way, the files I've already got have FY15, 16, 17, and 18 data. And that's why I was saying being able to tell them whether you want trend data or not is important, because they can just ignore the 15 to 17 data, or you'll have it handy. I did that because it means that then you'll have data that's completely harmonized with how we've done analyses over the past 4 years at IMLS. So, so like I say, using the 15 to 17 data may be something you don't do, but it's very easy to pull that out because there's a separate variable. So it's separate Excel files. They won't have to, you can just, send it to them in an email, and be able to do that. Does that clarify well enough for everybody? I know that is a big question, given that like you can go online and look at some stuff, but this is meant so that you have a designed data file that is already harmonized.
I think that's really great, Lisa. And we did have one follow-up question just about the 2020 data set, which is confusing to be sure. You will not report on your 2020 federal award in the SPR until the end of the calendar year this year. We as IMLS don't typically review that and sort of package it up or have it available for public consumption until March. Well, guess what? That's when your evaluations are due. So we can't give you the 2020 data in time for this to be useful. So you are going to have to be responsible for providing it to your evaluator in some more expedited fashion. And if you need our help with modes of doing that, we can talk to you about it. But the two kind of premier years that we're going to be able to give you are 2018 and 2019. And even now we have states with extensions. And so packaging up the full national data set has been very tricky this year. So you just bear with us, we'll get it to you as soon as we can. If you have evaluators on board right now, let us know and we may be able to, send you something early, but those data files will come later.
And are there other questions? I'm trying to look at the chat on one of the other computers I've got.
There was one that was partially answered in the chat, but I think for the sake of the recording, it would be helpful to surface it again. And this is kind of a state perspective. So what role do LSTA coordinators generally play in evaluation as compared to, say, a state librarian or chief officer? We have a first-time LSTA coordinator in this and just wondering what the role would be. And so a few states responded. The coordinator's role is in Michigan, for example, to manage and oversee the evaluation and report back to the state librarian. And let's see, Iowa, the LSTA coordinator does the majority of the work. There may be other examples I haven't seen yet, but if anybody else wants to chat to that or speak to that, and we will have a chance in the breakout sessions, if you are part of the evaluation breakout session, to sort of further probe into that.
And just doing a quick time check, we have about 10 minutes left, so we're in pretty good shape.
Great.
So are there any other questions that folks have about the files or the work or what you can do with them?
Lisa, I just wanted to say, as somebody who, in a very amateur way, tried to work with a raw SPR data dump and make sense of it, I have a very newfound appreciation for all that you have to do. The reason why they're not completely ready, kind of popped out of the oven as soon as we accept the SPR, is because translating so many of those conditional, was this offered statewide? Yes, no, and all of those kinds of if this, then that threads of logic and trying to get them to make sense in a more linear Excel fashion is no small undertaking. So I am appreciative of the packaged data files. And I think that's also emphasizes the difference between sort of the abbreviated dashboard version that kind of mostly focuses on dollar amounts, because those are easy to kind of point a one-to-one relationship with. And that's why those are more immediately available to users compared to the big thing that you're putting together.
I did see a question we missed on our first pass from Debbie. Debbie Musselman, sorry, can the evaluators have direct access to the SPR? The answer is yes. We did see a number of evaluators last cycle that had access to the SPR. And this time we have a new user role that might facilitate that a little better. It's the SLAA project data entry, which IMLS would need to set up for you. So once you have an evaluator on board, if you want them to also have access to the system itself, in addition to these data files, you're going to be getting, just be in touch with your program officer.
And Terry, correct me if I'm wrong, what we would give them the outside evaluator access to would be the data for that particular state, correct?
Correct.
Well,
although Lisa has one data file that has some national level data in it. Lisa, do you want to just touch on that again?
Yeah, the project level file, and I'm trying to think of the best slide to use. Go down to this one here. So I know it may be kind of small, but so in the project level file, there's high level budget information, just total budget, LSTA budget, match, as well as some information about the lessons learned. So being able to sort of pull some of that up for the state, that might be something that evaluators could really do, is say, hey, well, your state just did all of these projects related to digital literacy, let's see if there are other projects in the SPR that have done something as well, as sort of to provide some lessons that could help in the future with our state's projects. So that project level file will have other state information. And again, that's why, I mentioned that one of the things you'll need to do is to give your evaluator instruction about the extent to which you want them to look at other states or not look at other states. And again, there could be some usefulness that they could pull out of that, or it could be that you just don't want them spending all their time doing that, right? So it's, you got to think about how much time you really want them to allocate to different tasks. The activity file is just too big to give you all of the data for all the states. And so that will be just for your state only.
And David in Florida is saying, so to clarify, you, IMLS, are going to make appropriate data files available to us. If so, how will that be delivered? And the answer is yes, we are. And I imagine we would deliver it much like we did last time, where your program officer would send you an email attachment or two. If the files are too large for some reason, we'll figure out something with our shared file system.
Yeah, I don't think the files are too huge. I think that worst comes to worst, you could always zip them up as well. I think that I think that's part of the reason why I kept the activity files specific to a state. But still, some states that have a lot of activities could have a pretty good sized file.
We have another question around the state role. Do state data coordinators have a role in the evaluation in some of the states? And we welcome you in the chat box to answer if that is the case for you. There's another question to clarify the time frame for delivering the files. At this point, having seen that most of your evaluators would be coming on in the summer or fall, we would anticipate maybe, very late spring or summer being able to make these files available to you. Again, it is a little dependent right now on all the extensions that we had for this year due to COVID and getting the national level data packaged up so that we don't have to keep resending you different iterations of files. There were a few responses to the data coordinator question. In California, the state data coordinator is part of the working group. In Maine, the data coordinator is part of the evaluation of the program, but not the overall evaluation. You probably didn't read that out very clearly. And in Missouri, our state data coordinator gathers the data yearly, and we do a cumulative evaluation each year to see how we were doing and meeting our 5-year goals. So kind of incremental participation. Any other questions for Lisa? We still have a few minutes. Lisa, any last thoughts as you impart your wisdom upon our group of states?
It has been an honor to work with all of you in the past 4 years, and those of you who are new, this is one of the most awesome communities to be able to be a part of. And I really, I remember we went through, right when I came on board at IMLS, we went through the first 5-year evaluations and did some work with that. And I'm hoping that the work that I've done here will really help your evaluators spend less time trying to figure out the data and more time really answering those key questions that that Matt laid out yesterday, and that will really help to ramp it up. So thank you all so very much for letting me play your reindeer games. This has been awesome.
Thank you, Lisa. You're getting a lot of love in the chat box right now. And
I'm gonna cry.
We add to it. Yeah, we miss you so much. Department of Energy better appreciate you. That's all I'll say. We are headed into a break right now, a 10-minute.
All right, well, welcome back. Michelle and I are now going to give you a guide through the components of developing your new 5-year plan for the years 2023 through 2027. Seems so far away, but it's right around the corner. So this is your opportunity to map out your next big adventure. So the purpose of your 5-year plan will establish your goals for the next 5 years. You'll use your evaluation that Matt and Dennis talked so wonderfully about yesterday to inform this new plan. And most plans, though, are written in-house by the SLAA, not by a third party. But if you do prefer to contract out for your new plan, you may do that if you like. We do have guidelines available to help you develop your new plan on our website, and we have a link to it here in the slide and also a nice screenshot of what that looks like. This guidance is very similar to the guidance that we've had for previous plans. Not a whole lot has changed. And it also includes citations to the statute that has established the plan requirements, if that is something of interest to you. So feel free to reference that document. So what constitutes your 5-year plan? Well, these are each of the components in order of the plan. There's a lot of them. We're only going to be talking about a few of the heavy hitters, which are these that we have here. And there's the ones that people typically have questions about. And we want your 5-year plan to be specific enough for you to use as a guide for the next 5 years, something you can refer back to and keep you on track. But we also want it to be broad enough for you to allow flexibility when new situations and new opportunities arise, such as a pandemic or something like that. So the first section we're going to talk about is your needs assessment. Now, this needs assessment should be based on your most recent evaluation that you will have completed at this point, along with any additional complementary data you may have, as well as any advisory input that you collect. You should describe those data sources and the processes you use to document your state's needs, as well as those audiences to whom those data sources apply to. You'll also want to discuss the methods used for the data analysis and how you may periodically update your state's knowledge of the library services needs. Now, you'll hear us say this a lot. You heard us say it in the evaluation presentations, but it's really important to engage your stakeholders in this needs assessment and really throughout the entire plan process. Now, next we have our plan goals, and these goals are really the backbone to your 5-year plan and the most important part, and really the only part of your plan that we would consider to be in stone. All goals must address needs that align with the LSTA priorities, and that's outlined in the statute. And each goal should address at least one need that came through in that needs assessment. We found that we want you to keep the verbiage in your goals pretty short, pretty succinct. And we've also found that fewer, broader goals are better. You can see that this graph here on the right shows the difference in the number of goals between the 2013 plan that you all developed versus the 2017 plan. You can see that in 2013, 2 states had as many as 8 or 9 goals. But by the time we hit 2017, those went down, and we only had a few states in the 6 to 7 range of number of goals. We think that the sweet spot for the number of goals you should shoot for is 3 to 4. That seems to be your best bet. Now for projects. Now we talk about how your goals should really be kept broad, where your projects is it's an opportunity for you to get more specific with what's in your plan. And your projects should be included in the narrative of each goal. Now, when discussing your project, you need to explain what will be done, for whom, and the expected outcomes of those projects. You'll also want a timeline of activities throughout that entire 5-year period. Now, do not feel pressure at all to include every single project you're ever going to do in your 5 years. This is really just a sample, and it's good to include projects that you know that you do on a standard basis and from year to year kind of stay the same. And those can be both sub-granting projects or statewide projects. It can be anything from, state databases, summer reading, courier services, ebooks, or talking books. But again, this is nothing in stone. This is just a sample. And next we have the coordination efforts section. And by coordination efforts, what we mean by that is partnerships or collaborations that will help you complete the projects that you mentioned, and therefore will help you obtain your goals. So specifically in the statute, it outlines for you to talk about coordination efforts around elementary and secondary education, early childhood education, workforce development. But really, you can include any other activities such that libraries are best at, like economic development and community development, or your health literacy programs. Just any intended partnerships you have with other agencies in your state. And again, by efforts, this doesn't have to include only partnerships that you have a written agreement with. These can just be your best of intentions, the efforts you plan to make, and they can change along the way in those 5 years. Now, the famous crosswalk. The crosswalk, you heard it mentioned in the evaluation, and it's also a requirement as part of those coordination efforts in your new plan. And this one here is an example of a crosswalk that you could include. This crosswalk connects your plan goals to those 6 IMLS focal areas, and it will ultimately be very useful for you when inputting those projects into the SPR. This example here is just one way to do it. You don't have to do it this way, and you can actually look at your current plan, your 2018 to 2022 plan that has a crosswalk in it. And if that formatting of the crosswalk is what works best for you, you can totally continue to do it that way. But it needs to include your state goal, the corresponding focal areas, sample projects within that focal area, and the aligned IMLS intent. Now I'm going to pass it on to Michelle.
Hi, everyone. In your 5-year plan, there is a section for information on how you're going to evaluate your plan. Your plan has goals, and each one of those goals should have objectives and indicators. An objective is what you want to achieve. An indicator is specific information that tracks a project's success. So, for example, an indicator would be, let's say, 25 out of 50 adults who attended a basic computer literacy skill class, that 50% of those participants at the end of the class could say they used Word. That's an example of a working indicator. Indicators help you answer the question, what does a successful project look like? How will you know if it's successful? Well, that's your objective and your indicators. You also need to include outcome-based evaluation questions, and the SPR requires it, and it requires it for questions for projects that include public and library staff instruction, content creation or acquisition, and planning and evaluation. And you need to include the methodology you would use to evaluate your projects. The state program report has that information in it. It allows you to put some information in it. And on the IMLS website, we have copies of survey questions that you can use to provide you with that kind of outcome data. Next, please. Stakeholder involvement. You've heard about it and how important it is. By stakeholder involvement, we mean how will you involve your beneficiaries, the staff, project partners, IMLS, in essence, your full community in the process for your plan. Be specific about who your partners, your stakeholders are, and how you'll be involving them with your work. Are you working with schools, other state agencies? I know a number are. Other partners, for instance, the Center for the Book or Humanities Council. Many of you are using them. Some states like Kansas have regional library networks. How will they be a part of this? Head Start, etc. How will you involve them? Will you have meetings, phone calls, surveys? And how will you be transparent? Will your process be in your library newsletter, for instance? As mentioned in the LSDA statute, you may establish an advisory council that represents the library's entities in your state to help communicate with stakeholders that represent library entities, including public, school, academic, special, and institutional libraries, and libraries serving individuals with disabilities. So if appropriate, involve your state library advisory council. Next. Communication, very important. No, publicity means more than just posting it on your website. Think about the promotion of both your plan and your projects and what you're doing. Be as detailed as you can. Is there a role for some of your stakeholders in communicating with others about the plan? The state library must describe the channels that will be used to communicate to stakeholders the content of the state plan, as well as any results, products, processes, or benefits. Each state library receiving a grant must make the state plan readily available to the public and share it with the library community. Monitoring, yes, mostly what I do, but you also have to do it. State libraries must describe the procedures for tracking performance of the projects and the progress you're making towards what you said your goals were in the state plan. This monitoring should comply with the reporting requirements related to the state program report and can include pre-award risk assessments, which I know a number of you do, site visits, or even virtual check-ins or desk visits, which are good during this time when many people cannot travel. I'll be doing those myself this year with a number of my states. Your new plan must be submitted to IMLS by June 30th, 2022. IMLS then has 90 days to review, and we may ask for some changes, similar to how we ask for changes in your SPR report. After review, IMLS will send official letters of approval, and your new plan will go into effect on October 1st, 2022. IMLS does take your plan once it's approved, and we post that on our website, which is included on our website's Your State page on our website. Now, your plan has been accepted and approved. That's the one you're running under. And now what? Maybe you want to make a change 2 years in. Only substantial changes need to be approved by IMLS. And those would be like a change in one of the goals. Small changes, like deciding not to run a particular project, do not need IMLS approval. It'd be good to tell us if you want to, but you don't need our approval. If you need to make a change in your goals, you must submit that amendment to IMLS by April 1st. April 1st is specifically mentioned within the statute. And IMLS again has 90 days to review that change and approve your revised plan, which would go into effect on October 1st. So now we have a poll, and we can post that up. How much change do you anticipate in your overall plan? Still getting some answers?
And I also see a question in the chat while we're waiting from Leah Larson. Should we be referring back to our current 5-year plan to do our 5-year evaluation?
Well,
like-
Madison, do you want to?
The
Sure.
answer is yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah. it'll
And
be
by
great
the
for
way,
your-
Leah, no question is stupid. Believe me, if you're thinking it, somebody else is thinking it as well. So that's the whole point of having a training session. If we thought we knew it, you folks knew it all, we wouldn't be doing this. So thank you for asking that question. And I think we're coming close to sharing the poll results. Do you want to cover that, Madison?
I can't see the poll.
Oh, okay, then I guess I'll cover it. Okay, what we have is virtually unchanged. Only 11 states, or 12% of you, will be virtually not changing much of what you have in your current 5-year plan. 51 of you said somewhat changed, or 57%. Significantly changed, 6 of you will be doing that, and that's about 7% of our participants. And not sure yet, that's understandable. You don't have your evaluation yet. 22 answered that, or 24% of those participating in the poll. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the results. And I see a question in the chat, because we can take questions now, regarding revision to the 5-year plan. Can you request substantive changes more than once during the plan? Yes. There's no limit on changing it. It's just the deadline for April 1st of a particular year that you'd have to submit. And of course, when we're saying substantial changes, we're talking about a change in a goal. And sometimes that happens. I mean, it's not unheard of. For instance, you get a new governor, and all of a sudden the governor is putting additional money, state money, towards a particular thing, and you're thinking, hey, I think we should change our goal, or I think we should put more money towards some other project and a lot less on something else. And you feel you need to change your plan, and go for it, you know? And this is where we dialogue, you know? People aren't used to it. They're used to having a 5-year plan. It's a working document. It's not a do it and keep it for 5 years and don't touch it. As a number of your colleagues have said, they, at the end of every year, look at what they've done and how they're working towards their particular goals. And each state approaches their 5-year plan differently. Some people load up in the first year of the 5-year plan all their literacy projects, and in the second year they do something else, third year do something else. Other people do a little of a number of different types of projects throughout the 5 years. So you'll see that once you see the 5-year plans. Well, the current ones are currently up on our IMLS website, but everybody has their own style, and it's also the chief's decision and the state library's decision as to what direction you want to go and how many goals you have. So, you know, those are the things that can color, you know, what your decision and what you're going to do on your plan.
For purposes of the recording, Leah asked when folks start working on their 5-year plan. And it looks like many states say that they work on their 5-year plan concurrently with their 5-year evaluation. So you're kind of doing both at the same time.
Right. And some people have a separate plan besides the LSTA plan. So you have a state plan, and sometimes the terminology you use are a lot of the things that are meaningful in your state. So we don't hand you a template on that. We tell you the outline of what is required in your 5-year plan, but we don't tell you how specific language you need to use. We just tell you you need to address stakeholders, et cetera, and the other topics we talked about. And just think about it. I'm not surprised that 22 states are not sure if they'll be revising it. There's been a lot of change going on. We had COVID. We don't have the new census figures. That's going to change things. Technology has been changing things. Right. So, for instance, the Talking Book program has changed a lot over the last few years. And so you have to think, what will that be like in 5 years from now? So there's a number of different factors that will be coming into play, as well as your state budget and what you think your funding is going to be for the state library as you develop your new plan.
Right.
Just as a time check, yeah, we're right at 2:15. So Michelle, we're going to transition into your panel now.
Great.
And while that's getting set up, if there's any other questions that Madison maybe wants to tackle on the 5-year. I don't see any current ones in the box. And our three panelists are here. We've checked for them.
Great. Okay, can I start in?
Go ahead.
Okay, well, to give you an idea, why are we doing this particular topic? Well, unless you've been under a rock, you might have missed that ALA and many of our professional organizations are talking about cultural diversity and inclusion. And it's so much so that it's also showed up in our CARES Act and in ARPA. And your regular LSTA program has always said that you should not be discriminatory, et cetera. So we thought this would be a great time to talk to you about working with Native American and Native Hawaiian tribes. And so what we're going to do here in this particular session is have a panel discussion I'm going to start off with some information on other IMLS grants that you might want to know about, then turn it over to our panelists. And then I'm going to introduce each one of them now, each of the three speakers. And at the end, after Dale is finished speaking, we'll take questions. So let me introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Mary Villegas. Mary has, since 2006, worked at the Arizona State Library as a library consultant, providing outreach and support for tribal libraries, in addition to managing the state library's statewide electronic resources. Mary has a Bachelor of Science in Finance and a Juris Doctor from Arizona State University. Prior to joining the state library, she worked in the telecommunications industry for over 9 years, managing financial operations, human resources, and other internal operations. She also worked with the Arizona Commission of Indian Affairs as a business development representative and taught Indian law at a local community college. Our second speaker, Erin LaFramboise, was a Montana State Library Commissioner from 2014 to 2020 and State Library Commissioner Chair in 2019. She has worked 11 years at the Blackfeet Community College Library, and the last 4 of those have been as director. Erin is an active member of the library community and is currently Vice President of the American Indian Library Association and also serves on the advisory board for ALA President Julius Jefferson Jr. Dale Savage is the head of the Library Development Bureau in New Mexico. He comes to the New Mexico State Library from the Arizona State Library, where he served for 8 years as a continuing education coordinator. Prior to that, he was the La Paz County Librarian and the director of the Parker Public Library, a Library Journal 5-star library. He's a graduate of the University of Arizona SIRLS program and works at various branches in the Pima County Public Library while working on his library degree. He has served on the Maricopa County Library Council Continuing Education Committee and is a founding member of the ASLA Professional Development Committee. He served 4 years on the MPLA board and 5 years on the ASLA Executive Board. In 2016, Dale was the recipient of the ASLA's Newton and Betty Rosenweg Distinguished Service Award for 10 years of service to libraries and librarians of Arizona. Prior to becoming a librarian, Dale worked for 25 years as a linguist anthropologist, supporting mother tongue literature and literacy in Mexico, Belize, Guatemala, and the Philippines. So now I'm going to give a little introduction to an overview. Next slide. Just to give you the big quick picture, there's 574 recognized tribes by the federal government, and over 5 million people call themselves Native Americans or Native Hawaiians. When I put this slide together, I just thought I want to make it quick and clear. One of the key places you can go for information is the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They have a Bureau of Indian Affairs Tribal Leaders Directory, which I have the link here to. That's a great place to find out, for instance, that there's 5 federally recognized Indian tribes in Maine. They're not all out west, folks. There's one in Florida, for instance, or one in Virginia. You can find that out in the name of the person. The next link, the Native American Organizations to Know, is just a quick link to a number of other organizations, Native American organizations that you can work with or partner with. Next slide. IMLS offers the Native American Library Services Basic Grants. These grants are $6,000 to $10,000. They're for 1 year, there's no cost share, and they're non-competitive grants used to support existing library operations and maintain core library services. They can be used to buy library materials, fund salaries and training, provide internet connectivity and computers, or develop public and private partnerships. The deadline, the next deadline is April 16th. And just to give you a sense of this, in 2020, there were 172 applications. And in 2019, there was 188. In both years, all of those applicants received funding. So the money is there. We'd love to see applications. Next slide. The Native American Library Enhancement Grants are $10,000 to $150,000. They cover a 2-year period. Again, no cost share, but these are competitive, nationally competitive. And they cover preservation and revitalization, educational programming, or digital services. The deadline for this program is May 11th. And to give you a sense of how many applications IMLS gets, in 2020, we had 33 applications or 34 applications, 33 of them received funding. And in 2019, 21 of the 33 applicants received funding. Next slide. We have a special program called Native Hawaiian Library Services Enhancement Grant. This is $10,000 to $150,000. Again, 2 years, no cost share, and it is competitive, nationally, well, competitive within Hawaii. Competitive grants that enhance existing services or implementing new library services, and they can do preservation and revitalization, educational programs, and digital services. Deadline for this is May 11th, and there were 8 applicants in 2020 and 3 received funding. And in 2019, all 3 applicants received funding. Next slide. We also have funding at IMLS for Native American, Native Hawaiian museums. Grant funding here is $5,000 to $100,000. It can be up to 2 years, the grant period. There's no cost share. And this particular program supports Indian tribes and organizations that primarily serve and represent them in sustaining heritage, culture, and knowledge through exhibits, educational services programs, professional development, and collection stewardship. And the reason why I mentioned this one is I think it's important because CARES and ARPA mentioned working with museums, and I think it's good for people at the state libraries to be aware of what people can get from IMLS besides the LSTA funds. In 2020, there were 21 of the 27 applications were funded, and in 2019, 18 of the 29 applications were funded. The deadline for the museum program is November 15th. So now I'd like to turn over our discussions, next slide, to Mary Villegas. Mary?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Villegas, and I just wanted to share this picture with you. It's a picture of my grandmother. She's the one in the blue dress, and she's at a sunrise dance. And a sunrise dance is a coming of age ceremony for young women, and this is on the St. Carlos Indian Reservation. And I like this picture because I think this picture represents how culture brings communities together. Next slide, please. So when working with tribal communities, I think it's a good idea to understand the big picture and also understand a little bit of the history when working with tribes in your state. First, as we all know, there's been a long history of federal and state governments not working well with our tribal communities. In fact, it wasn't until 1975 that the Self-Determination Act came about, and it allowed tribes to start contracting with federal government to administer their own programs and services. So tribes at that point could actually have their own tribal schools. They didn't have to send their kids to the Bureau of Indian Affairs schools. They could have their own roads departments. They didn't have to rely on the BIA. So this was a critical time when self-determination really came about, and tribes could start managing their own people and their own tribes. They didn't have to depend on the BIA. And there's some considerations that I kind of look at when I work with tribal communities, and hopefully this might resonate with some of you. And the big one is tribal culture. Tribal culture is critical, and we need, and I think libraries can support tribal culture by helping them with getting books for their libraries that tell the history. But when you're working with tribes, as far as tribal culture, the takeaway from this is when you work with individuals, don't impose what your beliefs are on tribal folks. And the one I hear a lot is, oh, well, they have their arms crossed. They must not be happy, or they're not looking at me, or they seem distracted. And so maybe they're not, this isn't of interest. And that's not the case. There's just a different culture, and don't impose maybe what you think is appropriate and think that they're not responding to you. As far as tribal laws, the takeaway from this is understanding that tribes often have different procedures that may hinder a process. So for example, if you're working with a tribe, they might say, well, we can't do this. And that might be because they have a tribal law in place. In addition, they might have different holidays that they recognize. A lot of tribes do not recognize Columbus Day, and there's a reason for that. So understand that they might be open when you're closed. As far as federal laws, this is a big one when you're working with a tribe on a project. There are so many hoops that tribes have to jump through. They have to follow numerous acts like the Endangered Species Act, the Endangered Flower Act, that could, and there's just so many things that could tie up a project that you might think, well, it's just too hard to work with the tribe. Well, it might be, but I would just say understanding this ahead of time might make you less frustrated, and understanding of how even it's frustrating for them. I used to work for a reservation and used to get so frustrated. As far as state laws, in Arizona, we don't have a state law that defines what a library is. So it gives us a lot of flexibility on helping tribal libraries. And a takeaway from this, as far as state laws, think about the other entities. As far as you have your states, you have your counties, and you have your cities. And a lot of times, at least in Arizona, counties provide services for our tribal libraries. For example, we have some awesome county libraries that actually include tribal libraries in their ILS. They pay the part of the salary for some of our tribal librarians. They also help them do E-rate or help them do their annual library statistics. So these are things I think you want to know if you're going to provide outreach and service to your tribal communities. Next slide, please. And this is Arizona. We have 21 federally recognized tribes, but we have 22 tribal communities. And it's important to understand who you're serving. In Arizona, we don't have a lot. We only have one treaty tribe. That's the Navajo Nation. And we don't have chiefs. We have tribal chairmen. And these are just some things you might want to know before you maybe stick your foot in your mouth when you're working with a tribal community. Understand what the lexicons are and the proper terminology. We have 18 tribal libraries, and in Arizona, 27% of the land is tribal land. That's a lot of land. And also to put in perspective, the Navajo Nation, which is in the upper the upper right-hand corner, they are the size of Delaware. And it takes a lot. I mean, to wrap your head around it, there's 2 tribal libraries in that community, and they're the size of Delaware. It's a lot of it's pretty much a desert for libraries, just as it is a food desert, because they hardly have any grocery stores too. And a takeaway for myself when can you go to the next slide, please? When I work with tribal libraries, is face-to-face communication. And that's what we do in library development. And this is a organizational chart of the Library Development Division. We are under the Secretary of State. This is just one of the divisions. All our divisions support tribal libraries in Arizona. Our Braille and Talking Book Library, they provide services. Our research library has provided consulting services when one of our tribes had questions about preservation. But in library development, we do a number of things, ranging from digital inclusion to tribal outreach, project support, and I'll get on that in just one second, early education, continuing education, public library stats, and LSTA grants. But I think the linchpin to all of this is project support. And that means that when we work with tribal communities, if you don't get a telephone call back immediately or an email back immediately, it doesn't mean they're not interested. It means their internet could be down, or it means the wind blew and it blew down their satellite, and that's why you haven't heard from their an email from them. That actually happened with one of our tribal libraries. Their internet was down for 6 weeks. So I think it takes patience and understanding when you work with tribal libraries. They're our most underserved communities in the nation. And COVID, I think, really put a spotlight on that. Unlike public libraries, they got to work from home. They could telework. That's not the case for tribal libraries. They might have internet in their libraries, but when they were sent home, we couldn't connect with them. So I think going forward, we need to recognize that, again, they are when COVID happened, that they did not have the resources, and we need to be able to support them. And I think the libraries, our state libraries, can really support those services. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Erin. And if you have any questions, I'll be here at the end.
Hi, so I feel like I have a very unique take on this subject as I work in a tribal library. I'm a tribal member, and I've had the opportunity to work with the state library in the capacity of it as commissioner. So next slide. In Montana, there are 8 federally recognized tribes. That's actually very new to us because about 1.5 years ago, we had the Little Shell tribe got federally recognized after years and years of trying to have recognition from the federal government. So out of the 8, at least 7 of the tribal communities have libraries. On the Flathead Reservation, there are multiple public libraries, the college library, and a couple of special libraries, school public libraries. On the Blackfeet Reservation, there are 2 libraries, the college library and a branch of the county library. Rocky Boy only has their college library, Fort Belknap as well. Fort Peck, their college library is actually merged with the local county branch. And so they serve as both public and the college library. And then down in southern Montana, the Crow Reservation and Northern Cheyenne, they each only have 1 library through their tribal colleges. So 7 of us have tribal colleges. We all have libraries. And so one of the things that has been brought to light is that our tribal college libraries are often not just academic libraries. We're often serving our communities. And in all of the ways a public library would serve the community, but without any of the funding for the public library. So we do as much as we can with little to no funding as far as reaching out to our public. And next slide, please. My work with the state library was really eye-opening because as a tribal member and entity of a tribal library, it was really great to know like why we can't be denoted as public libraries, why we don't get state funding for per capita funding for our libraries. And a lot of that has to do with what's in statute. And so changing that statute would, can happen. It's just going to take a little bit of time and effort. There has been effort to adjust the state library standards to make sure that the tribal libraries also can meet those. And there are some things like having community funding, like tax-based funding. A lot of reservations have a very hodgepodge of taxable land. And so there's not a lot of taxes, and there's actually federal money that gets pumped back into things like schools and local governments to help because of the taxable land issue. So that's, one of the things that we just can't do is we don't have a lot of, we don't have a tax code on the reservation, and the funds that are, the lands that are taxed go to the county. Next slide, please. But I definitely feel like Montana does an amazing job with their LSTA funds as far as reaching every community in Montana. Tribal libraries have never been not included in any of these initiatives. And there are other non-LSTA initiatives that the Montana State Library has that also make sure that tribes are a part of their advisory boards, or are often, they're open to grant funding and other things like that available through the state library. So consulting, everyone in the state is available to ask the consultants questions. Shared catalog, there are 3 out of the 7 tribal college libraries that are a part of the shared catalog. Shared subscriptions, this isn't always LSTA funds and has in the past been from a very special funding source in Montana. And that's a very volatile funding source. So shared subscriptions kind of come in and out of vogue whenever we have the money. Pilots. So during COVID, the hotspot lending pilot has been very useful for my community, and I know that other tribal communities have been a big part of the hotspot lending. And the college got CARES Act funding, but in our community, there were still people who needed internet access, not being able to come into our library. And so the hotspot lending pilot has been great. I think a lot of libraries, not just the tribal libraries, are thinking about ways to maintain those types of programs. There are things that our state is so large and so varied as far as services. Things like the courier pilot didn't actually reach any reservations except the Flathead Reservation. And so, as far as reaching out to the Native tribes for courier of materials from library to library, it wasn't just our libraries that were excluded in the courier project. So continuing education, everything is open and available to everybody. And then the Montana Memory Project, the state library is constantly trying to encourage more tribal content in the Montana Memory Project. Next slide, please. So who helps make those decisions? And I'm really happy to say that on every single one of these advisory boards, task force, councils, that at least there's attempted tribal participation in all of these things. So if it's library specific, there's always a spot for a tribal librarian within the Network Advisory Council. On all task force, there's always a spot there for someone who's working in a tribal library, just so that we have that voice at the state library. One thing that is hard to address is the fact that a lot of Native people do not live on the reservations. So how do you reach all Native people within the state when, you know, half of them live in the cities and, you know, in other communities? And, you know, my advice for the state library has always been to just acknowledge that there are Native people outside of tribal communities, and to just continue to do the best to serve every Montanan. So that concludes my part. Next slide, we'll bring it over to Dale.
Hello, everyone. My name's Dale Savage. I'm happy to be here with you today. And I'm the Bureau Chief for Library Development in New Mexico, and formerly worked with Arizona. And I just want to say up front that that slide that Mary had with the 4 interlocking pieces and considerations in tribal library work, just to underscore, yeah, things can be different in different states, but there was a lot of good material there for anyone who's interested in working in tribal libraries. Next slide. Okay, and in Arizona, we have 19 pueblos, and those are designated with the diamond shapes. 16 of those 19 have tribal libraries. Next. There are 2 Apache reservations, one in the far south, Mescalero, and up in the north, in the central part of the state, the Jicarilla Apache Reservation. And we also have a significant portion of the Navajo Nation in New Mexico. There are 50 chapter houses in New Mexico, and they're scattered across the portions of the reservation you see there. And there's also a portion between the Navajo Indian Reservation in the far northwest and the Jicarilla that's called the checkerboard. So there's kind of an intermix between private and Navajo land across there. There's currently 1 official chapter house library on the Navajo reservation, but one of the projects that Arizona's working on, and we're also working on, is the Navajo Nation would like to establish libraries in those 50 chapter houses that are in New Mexico as well. Next slide. Significant issues that we have here in New Mexico. One is there really is very strong sovereignty of pueblos and tribes. And you might say it goes back to the 1680 Pueblo Revolt, which some people refer to as the original American Revolution. The Spaniards had penetrated into northern New Mexico prior to that. And in 1680, the Pueblos rose up and they drove the Spaniards out of New Mexico for 12 years and sort of reset the relationship. It still wasn't great when the Spaniards were allowed to come back in 1692, but it set a tone where even as early as in the 1860s, President Abraham Lincoln recognized the sovereignty of the Pueblos and gifted the Pueblos with ceremonial canes that are still kept by the governors today. And the Pueblo governors meet annually and more in New Mexico. There's a strong legislative representation of tribal members in New Mexico, and that really sets a tone. There's also a state law that mandates that government agencies here cooperate and work with the tribes. And each year we have to present a report on tribal and state collaboration. So there really is a tenor and a tone here for that. One of the things that Mary alluded to in New Mexico, in Arizona rather, is the state laws aren't terribly specific with regards to libraries. On the other hand, New Mexico is a much more bureaucratic state, and there are New Mexico administrative codes that define what a library is, that define who's eligible for funding, and they can be very strict. They can be a barrier to establishing and funding libraries. And in fact, that's one of the problems that the Navajo chapter houses have right now. We're working to be as supportive as we can, but there's a fairly high barrier in those administrative codes as to what libraries actually are eligible to receive funding. Next slide. The services that New Mexico State Library offers to tribal libraries, of course, are library consulting services. And we, like Arizona, actually have a position within library development for a tribal libraries program consultant. It's currently vacant, and I'm filling a lot of those duties, but it's one of the salient features within New Mexico, salient enough that we have one person who's dedicated to work with each of those 19 Pueblo libraries. There's also funding that's specifically available. There's a state grants and aid program that currently provides about $9,000+ a year to each of the libraries. There are tribal libraries program grants, which again they're a line item in the state library budget. We have money set aside to give grants specifically to libraries that they can use on salaries, materials, professional development, things of that nature. And another feature of library funding in the state of New Mexico is every 2 years, the state legislature votes on general obligation bonds for public libraries, school libraries, tribal libraries, and also academic libraries. And then in the next year, that goes to the public to either approve or not approve the bonds. For example, though, right now, the libraries have active general obligation bond money from 2018, which amounts to anywhere from 39 to 42,000 per tribal library. There's an allocation per library, and then there is a per capita amount that's also figured into the calculation. The 2020 GO bonds have not yet been totally allocated, but they're expected to be worth 26 to 27,000 plus per tribal library. And also the state of New Mexico 2 years ago established a rural libraries endowment for communities with fewer than 3,000 people. And that takes in most, but not all, of the tribal libraries in New Mexico. The eventual goal is to get $50 million in that endowment. And the interest, once it rises to that, would pay $40,000 to $45,000 a year per library, which would include the tribal libraries. That's not fully funded yet, but it's something that the state has put out there. The state libraries also worked with several tribal libraries on broadband and E-rate initiatives, including helping to get fiber optic out to several of our tribal libraries. There's still several that are underfunded for that. I also wanted to mention that Michelle had asked us to comment on our working with the tribal libraries. And one of the things that Mary had in her considerations was culture. And one of the things to realize, and it's fairly salient here as well, since there's so many pueblos and different tribal culture's not the same from pueblo to pueblo, tribe to tribe. There's similarities, but it's not always the same. And it is important to understand and to get a grasp of what sort of the cycle of life among the pueblos and the tribes is. And in fact, it's interesting. Some of our tribal librarians work in tribes that are not their own. And some of them discover that, you know, their linguistic and their cultural barriers that they have to work with as well. But one of the big things in pre-pandemic was one thing. The pandemic we're in now is another, but it's frequent communication. As I said, we have one tribal libraries consultant whose job it is to stay in constant contact with those 19 Pueblo and tribal libraries. But in addition, our other library development staff who work with state grants and aid, who work with youth programs, who work with the general obligation bonds, each are in regular contact on those areas. And in fact, pre-pandemic, one of the things that we would do is every 2 to 3 years, we would have a site visit with our library development consultants, all of us sitting down at a tribal library, at actually all of the libraries in the state, but tribal libraries as well as the others. And so there's not just frequent contact through one consultant, but all of our consultants have very frequent contact.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. We have just a minute left in this session. I hate to break it up, but just wanted to do a time check.
Okay.
Thanks.
And I think we can open it up for questions. I'm sure we can all say a little bit more, but I really want to thank Mary, Aaron, and Dale for their wonderful information on working with the tribes. And we can take some questions. Reading. Our state attorney general has required us to use. Okay, our state attorney general has required us to include in project contracts a provision stating that any court cases would be heard in the state of Oklahoma court system. We recently had one tribe that was going to receive funds dropped from the program as their leaders saw this as a threat to their sovereignty. What advice do you have in navigating this situation? We want to remove all barriers possible to funding access and project participation. Any of our speakers want to respond?
Sure, this is Mary, and I completely understand that. So one of the things we went to is, it might not be similar, is we set up accounts at the state library level, and then we drop and shipped products to a tribe to get rid of the middleman, or to not have to go through tribal finance. So that was one workaround.
I don't think I'm seeing any more questions, and we're getting right down to the end here. I really, again, can reiterate, my speakers have been wonderful today, and I hope you all appreciate what they had to say. Right now, we will be, well, let's say it this way. If we were actually in person, you'd be making your taxi reservations and making sure you were checked out of your room. So for now, we're going to take a break and return back at 3:10. Hope to see you then.
Welcome back, and welcome to the virtual version of Programmatic Topics. This is our conference classic, and as we always want to get you all together to discuss great ideas about certain pressing issues or current events. We got super technically savvy to be able to do this over Zoom and online. So huge shout out to Dennis. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yes.
Shout out to Dennis for coordinating the technical side of things you won't see. So how is this going to work? We will break you out into groups based on what topics you selected in your conference registration form. And we have 2 rounds of breakout groups, and there'll be 20 minutes of discussion in each group. You will be automatically put into these groups. And then after that time is up, you'll be automatically brought back into the larger group. So there's no need for you to do anything on your part in terms of where you go. You will need, once you're in your group, you will need to designate one person to take notes and report out on the highlights of your discussion. And each group will also have an IMLS staff member as a moderator. And that person will also have some suggested questions to get the discussion going. But really, you can talk about anything concerning that specific topic. Now, if you can, please be sure to turn on your video during the breakout groups. After the first breakout, we'll have a quick 5-minute break, and then we'll reconvene and do the second breakout. Now, keep in mind, if you registered late or if you're in the room as a Terry, you won't be able to be put into a breakout group. All Terrys have to stay in the big group, except for the real Terry. But after the second breakout group, we'll all reconvene together, and those people who were designated to report out will share with everyone with what was discussed, and you'll have about 3 minutes to do that. So, session 1, these are the breakout groups with the corresponding moderator. You'll notice that if you chose the working with partners session as your first choice, that we put everyone together into one group for that, and that will be in the second part. But this was emailed to you beforehand, but just as a quick refresher, these are the folks who will be assigned to diversity inclusion with Laura. These will be the folks who are assigned to LSDA virtual management with Terry, the real Terry. These are the folks who will be assigned exemplary projects with Michelle. Pandemic issues and ramifications will be with me. I won't be in your group quite as automatically because I'm the host, but I'll get there as soon as I can. And then we have 5-year evaluations with Matt Birnbaum. All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording very briefly to just review our next review groups really quick. For breakout session 2, we have the same sessions with the same moderators, along with the new working with partners that will be paired with Dennis. For diversity and inclusion, these are our folks in that breakout with Laura. Virtual LSTA management with Terry will be these folks. Exemplary projects with Michelle. Pandemic issues with me. 5-year evaluations with Matt. And lastly, working with partners with Dennis. Cool. All right, I'm going to pause. And now that I believe everyone is back, and apparently we've been recording that whole time.
No, I just started.
Okay.
No worries.
Thank you. All right, great. We're going to go with the first breakout from diversity inclusion. Whoever our reporter outer is.
Well, in our group, we didn't really design one, so I had a yellow pad, so I took notes. So for the diversion and inclusion session, people talked about whether to add EDI to their subgrants. And we got into a discussion of what unserved means, whether that extends to racial and ethnic groups, or is it just poverty and disability status. In Virginia, they have definitely added EDI to their state plan. In fact, there's a cabinet level officer that was added to state government on this subject. Oklahoma said they feel like they're doing pretty good because while they're going to have more conversations about EDI, they've always offered grants and services to tribal libraries. That's just something they do standard over time. So they feel like they've got a leg up on that. Nevada talked about, she's not sure where to start with EDI, and there have been some real pushbacks on EDI in her state, that one of the libraries was posted Black Lives Matter statement, and it's like the sheriff and a bunch of other people came down on them, and there's been an internal investigation. So that sounds like it's sent ripples through the library community. I talked about the fact that, you know, we're not as far along as other states are, but I'm looking at 2 of my vacant positions in library development to add an inclusive services component to one existing job and a tribal library component to another existing job. So we at least have some coverage, you know, small staff, many hats. Wisconsin talked about using the Division of Public Instruction data to understand who the underserved are. And so they've got some pretty clear configurations on where that is. And he said that it's been an interesting conversation within his agency, in that they're coming to the conclusion that they can't give one grant and solve EDI in Wisconsin, that all they can do right now is move the needle on a huge problem. And that's something, you know, if you want to think you're going to solve a problem, that's sort of a hard thing to get your head around, is that this is going to be a very incremental process. We talked about the lack of diversity among our staff. We also talked about, when we do workshops for library staff, is it always to the director, or do we need to reach down further within the staff of libraries? Talked about staffing issues, and we talked about sometimes, even when you do make an effort to address this, that sometimes the results aren't great. In Alaska, we've had a scholarship we've given out since 1992 with a preference for Alaska Natives. 87 scholarships have been given out, and we only have had 7 with Alaska Native ethnicity. So sometimes, you know, you try and something doesn't work, and it's like, what do you do next? Do you change it? So anyway, that was our discussion in one group.
We didn't choose anybody in our group either, but I'll go ahead and report. I did take a couple of notes. Several people said they had them as projects in their current plan and will make them bigger and more inclusive in their next plan, and kind of spread it out throughout all the projects and make sure it's covered everywhere instead of having a limited focus. Massachusetts did talk about they've changed their scoring for subgrants to include an EDI component, which I thought was a really good thing to do. And that you know, that then becomes a basis for being funded. One of the other things we talked about, Montana is revising their standards and looking at making it an expectation for having EDI in order to be compliant with standards statewide, which I liked. Not that I want to revise our standards again, we just did it recently. And that they also have a different IMLS grant that is working on writing strategic plans and helping the smaller rural places. I think this is what I heard, in including EDI and that implicit bias in their strategic plans. And so kind of taking that focus on it moving forward too. Oregon talked about focusing on understanding the communities and putting thinking into that. So your underserved communities and how do you, putting that's where their money is going is serving the underserved communities, which then gets you into some of that diversity and equity. We talked some about barriers. There are legislators across the country who are making new laws that limits what you can talk about when it comes to EDI and what you can train on. Massachusetts talked about doing an audit and which I think like an EDI audit throughout your whole program, which I think also is a good idea. And then California talked about the training that's required to learn the language and make sure everybody's on the same page when it comes to it, that is much harder. And I think that's what Patience was talking about, moving that needle incrementally and really making sure everybody understands what you're talking about when you start talking about EDI.
Thank you so much, Nancy, and thank you,
Sure.
Patience. Now we're on to virtual LSTA management, the first group.
Okay, that would be me. So basically, I think in the pro column, we had improved communications, sharing, support for each other, and opportunities that we didn't anticipate. And in the con group, I'd say time. So, and who knows what time meant in this last year, but also bandwidth, having enough, being able to juggle and balance different things. So it was kind of interesting because we had, of course, all these unexpected things happening, and lots of people went online with meetings. And for example, in Colorado, they said they started off with meetings twice a week, and then they went down to weekly, and now they're doing monthly. And it was a safe place for people to come and talk about what was going well and what wasn't going well. And it's kind of hard to carry the weight of everything and navigate everything gracefully. So it was good to be able to share that and communicate that. In North Carolina, they established special cohorts. So if libraries were doing hotspots and maybe they hadn't used them before, they could come together and meet and talk. And they said it was very successful because different library types were involved. They had academic 2 years and public libraries and school libraries. I think I got that right. Anyway, but it was a good, fun thing that I think is something we could use going forward with lots of different programs. And then one library, I can't remember which state this was now, had actually digital surveillance in a library. So for their checkout, it was just digital. And they said that one of the drawbacks with this is that it might actually lead to people thinking, well, they can do it all digitally. Why do we even need librarians? So, so we are challenged by capacity and trying to find a balance with being sure that we're keeping all of our regulations in force and being able to monitor. And of course, it's so different to try to monitor from a distance. But on the other hand, there are things that have been wonderful, like being able to send people for virtual conferences. And some of us had very limited to almost no success with that, whereas with other states, it was a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. So I think that's all I've got.
Thank you, Maura. What's group
And
2?
I'm building off that. I'm the group 2 one, and well, group 2 spokesperson. We had a lot of the same similar things, but one of the things that I'll notice was very different for us is that we had a person who was able to, one of the states was able to do more monitoring with the Zoom meetings and find things quicker with especially acknowledgement, like on the plexiglass. And if we bought this, put a little IMLS sticker on there, and we thought that was a great idea. We were all excited about that. We noticed that some people were able to attend more meetings when they were shorter and smaller, and we reached farther areas, especially when traveling as a distance is a problem. But then we also noticed that sometimes it was harder for the people who were going to longer things to take that block of time away, because they were busy trying to do other things and they couldn't be gone with all the other stuff going on with the pandemic. We also had that some of our libraries were able to reach new libraries that they'd never worked with before, because of like the CARES money and things like that. So they were able to reach people they had never granted with on some of them who did subgrants. Some people were feeling like it's hard to do everything because of limitations in the technology, especially with phones and forwarding phones and access to get, to be able to communicate with everyone. And a lot of people were able to do more, but also some were talking about if they would be able to hire more people to keep up with everything because of some of those restrictions also. I feel like that's just kind of some of the things. We also had a lot of the same things that group 1 had, so I won't go over those again, but I think that's kind of a little snapshot of what we talked about in group 2.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Now we're going to move on to exemplary projects. And if I could ask the people who are reporting out to just limit your talk to about 2 minutes.
Okay.
So we can stay on time.
Yeah, this is Debbie. We had a real good discussion. Some states say they use the box, some states say they don't. One of the criteria that one of the states uses is, would we want to use this as an example to show libraries how to manage a grant and what kind of impact it can have on a community, as well as if the project has excellent planning and management and the impact it has on the community as well. And does it go above and beyond what is normally expected? And also, is it innovative? Is it moving libraries forward? Is it sustainable, replicable? And also, somebody said that, is it a unique or different from what other states are doing? And they would tack it as an exemplary. And we had several different examples of, like, a teen writing project, day-by-day literacy calendar, and then consortia, collaborative projects, an action research project. And then somebody said what was once exemplary is now expected. And then if there was an exemplary project that was done several years ago and it hasn't been done, but it's outdated and needs to be updated, once it's updated, it would be an exemplary project again. So we had a really good discussion.
Thank you so much, Debbie. How about group 2?
All right, I had group 2. So we did express an interest in figuring out what we should designate as an exemplary project. And some of the examples were, would it be something that had national impact? Did it win a national award? Some states said that they always pick at least one, or maybe they try to always pick 2, but some generally don't bother. We did hear from Michelle that it's kind of helpful to IMLS if we do sort of tag some of those projects that they might want to look at in sharing out to some of their stakeholders about the work that they're doing. One person said that she asks herself, is it something that Michelle would put on the blog in order to determine whether it's exemplary or not? And one even said that they sometimes have, or that they have at least have heard of a state trying to pick one exemplary project per congressional district. But we pointed out that these can be decided on a state-by-state basis, what the criteria is. And definitely, if you want to see what other states are doing, look at the other SPRs on the IMLS website and see what you find there. Some of the exemplary projects that we discussed were peer coordinators working with persons who are experiencing homelessness or close to experiencing homelessness, health literacy initiatives, state book festival, upgrades or improvements in the Talking Book project, a STEM project for middle schoolers to make hovercraft, chronicling art and architecture in the state's libraries, and a state literacy calendar. And Cindy Boyden knows me a beer.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I will say to the whole group that as program officers, we really do love to see it when you highlight a project in your SPR report as exemplary. We're always looking on the lookout for those. Next is our pandemic issues, group 1. We have Angela.
Okay, sorry, that was me. I'm having mute issues today. So we kind of blurred all our questions together. As far as COVID impacting our grant projects, those of us with subgrants all talked about how the subgrantees had to pivot because they could no longer do virtual or in-person programs, things like that. Most of the state libraries reported having some challenges on the staff side just because we were all taking on extra projects. Or in the middle of large projects when the pandemic hit, and all of a sudden we're still doing all of those required work, but we're also trying to distribute money, help libraries pivot, make those changes and be even more responsive to libraries during all of this. Many of our libraries reported having to shut down their statewide courier services. There was a lot of talk about statewide database use. Some people saw increases, some people saw actual decreases. North Dakota talked about joining Overdrive during this time. They were able to join the consortium and they saw a huge takeoff in ebook use. Let's see, there was a statewide summer reading program kickoff. This was also North Dakota. And they talked about how they were able, because it was virtual, they did this week-long partnership with academic and school libraries that involved everyone. And one of the things a lot of libraries touched on was that the virtual programming that happened as a necessity is something we're all looking to do moving forward. A lot of people talked about wanting to continue offering things like continuing education and professional development to our libraries via these virtual and streaming platforms because it offered a way to reach libraries that might not be able to get in person, and it's really meeting them where they are. So a lot of this year has been about learning how to use those platforms to better reach our libraries. And someone mentioned this in an earlier reporting out, but the idea that there were some libraries that we had not previously worked with or reached or really met before that we were able to because we were reaching out with CARES money or to help them with these new projects. And so we want to keep that momentum going. And let's see. Oh, I thought this was a lovely note that there is a renewed recognition of state libraries and what they provide. And then just a couple other random notes. It's going to be hard convincing some staff to come back to the office because we've been home for a long time and feeling very productive. We've seen lots of retirements throughout our states. And I believe, was this in Illinois, where one school library reported that they were going to keep their access to ebooks because they were so popular and do away with their library. So some interesting ramifications. But let's go back to like everybody appreciating their state library and recognizing what we can do. We're going to end on that one. So that's group 1.
Woohoo. All right, group 2.
Wow, it's really hard to go after that when you hear all the things that came up in your group. So pivoting was the key word here for how COVID impacted our grant projects. Couldn't say that enough. Just had to restructure programs, and not only restructuring what we're doing at the state level, but also supporting libraries as they restructure everything. So it's like, double the pivot there. People were able to take advantage of vendor offers for all those different additional free support products and services that they were so freely doling out, and every grant opportunity under the sun, and every vendor had a free thing for you for a little while. What happened to all that stuff? Where'd that all go? And then the sort of bummer things like having to cancel projects, the backlog in the supply chain came up, and that's been very frustrating for a lot of folks. That made it difficult, if not impossible, to obtain some of those products that we were charged with going out and getting with some influx of some different monies that we were seeing. And then even having to lapse grants because of the inability to meet project goals. Let's see. New projects, statewide licenses like Read Squared, Beanstack, those came up. Participation in continuing education programs. Rhode Island specifically saw 400% increase in participation in CE programs, which is like, that's awesome. We also have similar data to support that, like skyrocketing in virtual CE near the start. And then you kind of see when people get tired of, get that Zoom fatigue, as it were. Provided guidance on reopening, delivery, quarantines. I liked this. We became scientists overnight, someone said. And then if vendors had their way, you know, I'd be buying every virtual reading program that was ever created. I don't think my phone really stopped ringing for like 6 months straight, and it was a vendor every single time. And give me the hook if I'm going too long here. And just again, echoing that more people were able to participate. You know, we're still not reaching everybody, but we're reaching some more people. And I think that's pretty important, but also just like, who aren't we reaching is a big thing here, and making sure that we're finding ways to connect to everyone. People were feeling more connected as a statewide group of librarians. And then everyone was sort of forced to learn technology that they hadn't known before too. So it like sort of sets us up for future success now that everybody's kind of had a taste and been involved. And then just being able to remain open as a state library, you know, to some extent, in quotes, right, open, to make sure that the library is still there to provide those curbside talking book and braille offerings that patrons need. So
Awesome. Thank
sounds
you, Michael.
Good. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. Next group is 5-year evaluations, breakout 1.
All right. So 5-year evaluations, we had a nice Q&A with Matt, and we had a lot of relatively new folks in our group. So there is definitely some trepidation or a lot of questions about how this whole process works. And so Matt asked the question, what is your greatest concern as you go into this process? And staff who are relatively new may be intimidated and would like to understand how to break it down into more manageable pieces. Some advice: it helps to consider your timeline, organize your goals and data before you get started. Start with your SPR data, obviously, but do some follow-up as needed to collect the new data. Decide how you want to work with your evaluator. Do you want to have data coming in from them throughout the process, or do you want to receive one report at the end as you're starting to work on your next plan? We had some conversation about the RFP process. It's much more cumbersome in some states than in others. While waiting for the RFP process to wrap up, what should we be doing to prepare? So we can make sure that we have our administrative records ready to go on day one as soon as our evaluator is on board. Make sure we know who our stakeholders are and think about how we want to involve them in this process. What depth of information should we expect the evaluator to ask for? Again, all the SBR data and any state level data that is required of grantees that may help the evaluator to better understand our progress on state goals. How much time should staff anticipate spending? This is going to be really variable, probably depending on your budget and your state size and all that. So Matt reminded us of the community of practice that will be coming together later this summer that may help to answer that question. Matt also said, don't stress if you don't have the most comprehensive data possible for your evaluation, especially for staff who are new and may have inherited some programs and we're not here to collect all that data. The evaluator is going to be able to identify where those gaps are, and they will be responsible for finding ways to collect that data to fill in those gaps. What should we not do in this process? Do not push unnecessary self-interests that will impact the development of your next plan. Don't allow the evaluator to influence decisions you are currently making, and be prepared to hear things you may not want to hear. It's how we learn to do better. A few more responses. In the next plan, some states would like to spend more time on fewer, larger projects that have a greater impact rather than on a lot of smaller projects. Someone was interested in understanding who they are not serving and how to measure that and how that could be written into the RFP. So talking about the development of the RFP, it's good to consider what skills we need our evaluators to have in advance in order to address whatever our goals are for the evaluation, in addition to the requirements. And Matt also added that it is really important to be able to trust your evaluator, whoever you select, that whether or not they have lots of experience specific to evaluating LSTA, it has to be a good fit for your program. And so just make sure you have a good feeling for your relationship with that person or group. Maybe a group would be better. Look for someone with evaluation skills and also someone with subject matter expertise, such as library administration. And Matt also gave us a couple of different resources to look for if you need a place to start looking for an evaluator. The American Evaluation Association, they have a subset of evaluators in arts and culture, and another group focused on public administration. And so that might be a good place to start. Another entity was on the museum side called the Visitors Study Association. And then finally, the folks at Ripple, Linda Hofshire, may be able to offer some suggestions. So in summary, take time to determine your needs, articulate those clearly in the RFP, and good luck, everybody.
Cool, thank you. How about group 2?
I was volunteered by Matt to take the notes for group 2. So thank you, Cara. Actually, I'd say ditto. You did a great job of reviewing. So I won't repeat some of the things that Cara mentioned, but I would say, let's see. As far as concerns, staffing veterans in some state library agencies who've retired, taking a lot of institutional knowledge. So again, concerns for folks who haven't done the evaluations before, wanting to make sure that they're taking into account all the things that IMLS is looking for. And then there was some discussion about comparison amongst states and whether it was required or recommended. And then I mentioned actually I was at IMLS when the 2 evaluations ago, when IMLS actually did a publication called Catalyst for Change, which really looked at as a national comparison. I don't believe we did do one for the 5 years ago. So that was really just a question as to whether or not IMLS might be doing that. Matt did say he's been having some discussions with Crosby Kemper, with the director. And then of course, there's the new SPR has been instituted since 10 years ago. So that makes a difference as well. I did mention that as I'm at the chief in Massachusetts, and we're a CAUSE line, it's the Council of State Library Agencies in the Northeast. We have a history of doing a group RFP for evaluations. And I believe I was actually in New Jersey when, and I was the LSTA coordinator in New Jersey 5 years ago. We had talked with the folks we hired about possibly doing a regional evaluation, just having a summary. And I think that would have been interesting. I don't believe that actually did happen. So I'm hoping we might be able to do that going forward. But as Matt did point out, of course, as everyone knows, every state library agency, if you've seen one, you've seen one. We're really quite different. Some of us do sub-grants, some do not. So I think there could be pluses and minuses of something like that. A couple of things I would mention, just really, it was mentioned in our group to make sure you want to make sure you're asking the right questions, and so hopefully it will really help to inform the next 5-year plan. And then as far as hiring an evaluator, we did talk about the pros and cons of hiring someone who actually did your prior evaluation, or 2 in some cases, having a newer outlook on the evaluation potentially. So pluses and minuses there. We did also talk about the timelines. It sounds like some states have already gotten started. They're hoping to finish by the fall. That's not actually what we've done in Massachusetts yet, but I think with CAUSE line, I believe it's something we're going to be looking at pretty soon, getting the RFP together. And I think, let's see, everything else I think was pretty much said. I just ask anyone else in my group if I've left anything out, because my note taking leaves something to be desired. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Sure.
All right, now we're with our final session, working with partners.
Yep, that was a really interesting conversation. I kind of wish we had had more time to kind of get into some of the challenges a little bit more deeply. But generally, the question was, how do you identify potential partners? And there are two aspects to that. One is the strategic aspect that is very purposeful, and then there's the serendipitous one as well. So strategically, you could look for mutual benefit and alignment with a partner organization. Do they have the same target audience, same goals? Or you could also look for partners and organizations who do things that you could support, sort of complement their work with what you're able to do, and vice versa. Examples of partners could be other state agencies and nonprofits, such as arts, humanities, organizations, historical societies, and so on. Know also what your sister agencies are doing. So some state libraries are connected or are structured a little bit differently in where they sit in the state. And some of them work closely with their sister agencies and really know what the work is that they're doing, and kind of are able to insert themselves that way as well. Getting in with other state departments has been a challenge, has been listed as a challenge for, I think, all of us. Labor and education came up more specifically, and some solutions to really engaging with those groups was to offer resources. For example, offer databases for school libraries. So even though I think this was Maine, I'm not certain right now, but even though they don't have a formal relationship with the Department of Education, they're able to engage with school libraries by offering resources. Oregon, and I know some other states, have a school library consultant to kind of build partnerships that way. Maine made inroads with Department of Labor by working on a specific grant and kind of got in that way. So a lot of it is really up to working on individual things that then might grow the relationship based on that. We all agreed that ultimately partnerships depend on personal connections, being at the table at the right time, listening for opportunities, connecting the dots. So if my state librarian is in meetings and identifying opportunities here, and connects that to things that I'm doing at my level, that's how these opportunities grow. So very, very much up to chance. Problems that we identified. Actually, the question that we hadn't been able to delve more deeply into was, how do we gracefully bow out of partnerships that are no longer beneficial, or that no longer work? And the best solution that Janet from Maine suggested is to use the 5-year plan to exit those relationships and kind of change our focus. So that was one solution that came up, and we hadn't gotten beyond that. So I don't know if my group wants to add anything to that.
Wonderful, Janet. Thank you so much. Well, that concludes our virtual programmatic topics session. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Madison. Yeah, and it was so, let me just say, it was so wonderful to see your faces and the voices of those that we just heard, and to be in the breakouts with you. We had a little, technological set of issues there, but you all pulled through like troopers. Thank you so much for being flexible with us. I will ask you to advance to the next slide, please. I think that one's got the survey on it. We would love if you would take the time right now to grab this link, this survey. And I don't know if it can be put into the chat, if someone from my team is available to do that, or one of you handy people out there, just stick it in the chat and start answering the survey at this moment while I'm talking, if you would, or immediately after the conference. We have gotten official approval to give you this survey, and your feedback means a lot to us. It helps us adapt our conference every single year and learn what worked and what we probably need to work on a little bit. So please be honest and let us know how we're doing, because we, like you, we're learning from our evaluations too. While this is up, I'm just gonna say a few housekeeping things. We will be sending For those of you that got awards yesterday, we will be sending those certifications to, I think, coordinators in the coming days. And we will comb through the chat. I think we did pretty good in answering a lot of the questions, but if there were questions that remained unanswered, we will be following up with individuals after the conference. We will do a round of sending out this survey link. If you happen to have colleagues who jumped off, couldn't be here right now, we will do just one more email blast to make sure that everybody gets this survey link. And of course, we've been saying throughout, the recordings will be available, but not immediately. So just bear with us. We have to make them accessible and do all the things that are required of us as a federal agency, and it usually takes a little bit of time. With that, can we forward to the next slide? I have some people to thank. The IMLS team and grants to states in particular did all of the planning for this. I had very little to do with this. You heard a lot of my voice on this conference, but we have a tremendous team, and Madison and Dennis and Michelle and Laura just did so much to keep this thing planned to what we thought would be the most pressing topics that you needed to know, and keep it running on time. So thanks to all of them. We appreciate our guest speakers from other offices, Matt and Lisa and Cam, and of course Crosby. And we had our IT staff sort of on call in case things went really haywire. So thank you to Sarah as well. Next slide. We appreciate also the state presenters that we had this conference, particularly on our evaluation panel yesterday. So thanks to Kelm, Karen, and Janet, and our Native American panel today. I don't think they're with us anymore, but we really appreciated hearing from Mary and Aaron and Dale. Next slide. And thanks to all of you. I mean, we certainly heard about Zoom fatigue in a few of our breakouts, and we know in a time when you are busier than ever, we appreciate you taking so much of your time to be with us over the past several days. Thank you for being the kind of people that we can laugh with in a time that the world probably needs more lightness. And thank you for upholding this program with integrity and giving your best day in and day out to make a difference with federal and state funds. We collectively have a big year ahead of us. We're not going to lie, but we look forward to doing the hard things together with you. Thank you, attendees, and we'll see you again soon.